I came home on a Tuesday afternoon to find my wife sitting at the kitchen table, completely still, staring at nothing. She wasn't crying. She wasn't talking. She was just empty, like someone had reached inside her and turned off a light. Our grandson, 8-year-old Thomas, was sitting across from her, eating crackers quietly, clearly not sure what to do. When I walked through the door and saw her face, my stomach dropped in a way I hadn't felt since my father passed 20 years ago. "Margaret," I said. "What happened?" She looked up at me and her eyes filled with tears almost immediately, but nothing came out. She shook her head slowly and looked back down at the table. Thomas looked at me. "Grandma was like this when I got home from school, Grandpa." I asked her what was wrong, but she just hugged me and didn't say anything. I set down my jacket. I walked to her and knelt beside her chair and held her hands. They were cold. It was October in Ottawa, but the house was warm. There was no reason for her hands to be that cold. I asked her again what happened, and she finally spoke, just barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm just tired." She was not fine. I had been married to this woman for 38 years. I knew the difference between tired and broken. I made Thomas a snack and set him up with a book in the living room, then came back to sit with Margaret. She still wouldn't tell me anything specific. She said she'd had a difficult day. She said she hadn't slept well. She said it was nothing. I didn't push. I'd learned long ago that Margaret processes things in her own time, and pressing her before she's ready only makes her close off completely. So, I made dinner. I put Thomas to bed. I sat with her on the couch until she fell asleep against my shoulder, but I couldn't sleep. We had a security system installed about 4 months prior. Nothing dramatic. Just a basic setup from a local company. 2 exterior cameras and 1 interior. 1 covering the main entryway and living room. I'd installed it mostly because there had been a string of break-ins in our neighborhood in the Glebe, and our neighbor Doug had suggested it. I barely thought about it most days. But that night, lying awake in bed, I remembered it existed. I got up at around 2 in the morning, went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the footage from that afternoon. What I saw made me set down my glass very carefully on the counter so I wouldn't drop it. My son had been there. My son, Daniel, and his wife, Renee. They had arrived at 1:30, let themselves in with the spare key we'd given them 2 years ago when Daniel had helped us with some renovations, and they had stayed for nearly 90 minutes. I watched the footage with the sound on. I had to replay certain parts 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Let me tell you a little about Daniel before I go further, because I want you to understand that what I'm describing did not come from nowhere. But it also did not come from anything I saw clearly until that night. Daniel is our only child. He's 41 years old, and for most of his adult life I would have described him as a good man. Hardworking, decent, devoted to his son Thomas. He has a degree in business from Carleton University, and he spent most of his 30s building up a small commercial property management company in the Ottawa Valley. We were proud of him. We told people about him. Renee I always liked less, though I kept that to myself. She's sharp in the way that makes you feel like every conversation is a negotiation. She's not unkind exactly, but there's something transactional about her that I noticed early and dismissed as just her personality. She came from money originally, from a family in Westmount, and she had a way of looking at things, including people, and calculating their value. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself she made Daniel happy, and that was enough. What the camera showed me was this. Daniel had sat down across from Margaret at the kitchen table, the same spot where she'd been sitting when I came home, and he had placed a folder of documents in front of her. Renee had stayed standing near the hallway, arms crossed, saying nothing for most of it. Daniel's voice was low and controlled, and he was using the tone I recognized from when he was a teenager, trying to talk his way out of trouble. Reasonable, patient, relentless. He told my wife that they were in serious financial difficulty, that the company had taken on debt to acquire 3 commercial properties in 2021, that the interest rates had crushed the carrying costs, that they were currently behind on 2 mortgages and facing potential power of sale proceedings. He said the number out loud. It was over $400,000 in combined arrears and outstanding loans. He said if they didn't resolve it within the next 60 days, they would lose everything they'd built. He would have to declare personal bankruptcy. They would lose the house in Barrhaven. Thomas would have to change schools. Then he pushed the folder across the table to Margaret. He told her that the documents were a refinancing arrangement, that all she and I needed to do was agree to act as guarantors on a new consolidated loan, using our home as collateral. He told her it was a formality, that the payments would be manageable, that we would never actually be on the hook for anything because he would have the business turned around within 18 months. He said our house, the house Margaret and I had paid off 3 years ago, the house we'd lived in for 26 years, would just be on paper. Nothing would change for us. Then Renee spoke for the first time. She said, very calmly, that if Margaret and I weren't willing to help, they would have no choice but to withdraw Thomas from the private school he'd been attending since September. She said she wanted to be honest with us about the consequences. She said this was ultimately our decision, but that she thought we should understand what was at stake. My wife had been sitting there alone, listening to her son describe financial ruin, watching her daughter-in-law essentially threaten the stability of her 8-year-old grandson's school year, and she had been asked to sign documents that would put a lien against our home on a debt she didn't understand, and she had not signed. She had told Daniel she needed to talk to me first, and Daniel had said, I'd really appreciate it if you didn't mention this to Dad yet. I want to be the one to explain it to him properly. I don't want him to worry unnecessarily. He had asked my wife to keep a secret from me. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. I did not wake Margaret. I did not call Daniel. I did not do anything that night, except sit and breathe, and let the full shape of what I had seen arrange itself properly in my mind. Because I knew from experience I spent 30 years as a civil litigation lawyer before I retired, so I know a thing or two about not reacting before you understand exactly what you're looking at. I knew that the worst thing you can do in a situation like this is move too quickly. Panic is the enemy of clarity. Anger is the enemy of strategy. The next morning I went to see my old colleague and closest friend, a man I'll call my lawyer, who still runs a practice on Elgin Street. We'd worked together for 15 years before I retired. I brought the laptop. I showed him the footage. I didn't say anything while he watched. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a moment. Do you want to know how bad this actually is? He said. Yes, I said. He started asking questions. How much equity did Margaret and I have in the home? What was the approximate market value? Did Daniel have power of attorney over anything? Had Margaret signed anything at any previous point that I might not know about? Did Daniel have access to any of our account information? I didn't know the answers to all of these questions, and that bothered me more than anything else. I went home and I went through every file we had. I checked our online banking. I called our financial advisor, a woman we'd worked with for 12 years at a firm on Bank Street. I told her I needed a complete picture of every account, every registered investment, every asset, and I needed to know if anything had moved or been altered in the last 6 months. What she told me took my breath away. 8 months earlier, Margaret had received a call, or so I was told, from someone identifying themselves as a representative from Service Canada, saying that her OAS payments had been flagged for a review and that she would need to re-verify her banking information. Margaret, who is trusting in the way that people who grew up in small towns often are, had provided the information. The call had been fraudulent, but when we traced the timing and the number used, it routed back to a prepaid phone purchased in Barrhaven, the same postal code as Daniel's house. There was also this. 3 weeks prior to the afternoon I'd seen on the camera, Margaret had met Daniel for lunch. She'd told me about it at the time, said it was lovely, that they'd gone to a place on Preston Street she liked. She didn't mention that during that lunch, Daniel had asked her to sign what he described as a beneficiary update form for a life insurance policy. She'd signed it without reading it carefully, because Daniel was her son and she trusted him, and because she didn't want to make him feel like she was suspicious of him. The form was not a beneficiary update. It was a limited power of attorney for financial matters, drawn up by a notary in Gatineau rather than an Ontario lawyer, in language carefully designed to look routine. I want to be very clear about something. I do not use the word evil often. I am a practical person. I believe most human behavior, including bad behavior, has an explanation rooted in fear, or desperation, or damage. But what Daniel and Renee had been doing, the systematic erosion of my wife's confidence and independence, the isolation, the secrets, the forged feeling documents, the attempt to weaponize our love for Thomas, this was not desperation. This was a plan. My lawyer spent 2 weeks reviewing everything. He brought in a forensic accountant. We looked at Daniel's actual business situation and found that yes, the debt was real, but the scale had been significantly exaggerated to us. The true shortfall was closer to $80,000, not $400. Manageable, if difficult. The numbers Daniel had presented to Margaret had been inflated, possibly to make our home equity seem like the only viable solution. During those 2 weeks, I acted completely normally. This was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I had dinner with Daniel and Renee and Thomas on the Sunday after I found out. I sat across from my son and I passed him the bread basket and I asked him how the business was going, and I watched him lie to my face with the smoothness of long practice. And I smiled and said, that sounded challenging, but that he always found a way through. I watched Renee pour herself a glass of Pinot Gris and compliment Margaret on the pot roast, and I said nothing. Thomas showed me a drawing he'd done of a hockey player, and I told him it was excellent, and he climbed into my lap the way he still does sometimes even though he's 8, and I held him and breathed through it. Margaret knew by this point that I knew. I had sat down with her 3 days after I found out and told her everything, calmly, without blame. She had not known about the power of attorney. She had not understood what she'd signed. She had kept Daniel's request for secrecy because she was frightened, and because she loved him, and because she had spent 40 years protecting that boy from consequences, and the habit was carved too deep to break in an afternoon. She wept when I explained it, not because she was weak. My wife is not a weak woman, but because there is a specific grief in discovering that someone you made and raised and loved unconditionally has been using that love as a tool. He held her hand. I told her we were going to handle it. I told her I needed her to do something difficult for a little while longer. I needed her to pretend nothing had changed. She did. She was remarkable. My lawyer worked quickly. The limited power of attorney Margaret had signed was challenged on the basis that it had been obtained without independent legal advice and through misrepresentation of its purpose. The forensic accountant prepared a full report on the discrepancy between the debt figures Daniel had presented to us and the actual state of his business finances. We documented the fraudulent phone call. We documented the camera footage. We documented everything in a sequence that told a very clear story. We also made a change to our own affairs that Daniel did not know about. Margaret and I had written our wills a decade ago, and they had left our estate, including the house and our investments, to Daniel as the primary beneficiary. We had never updated them because we'd never had reason to. Within 10 days of my visit to my lawyer's office, we had new wills prepared. We had also transferred the house into a family trust structure, on my lawyer's advice, which meant it could no longer be used as collateral without the trustees' consent. Daniel's name was removed from all beneficiary designations on our registered accounts. We restructured everything we could legally restructure, quietly, without drama. Our financial advisor was helpful and discreet. Then we waited. Daniel called on a Thursday evening, about 3 weeks after the afternoon I'd found on the camera. He said he'd been trying to find the right time to talk to me, and that he really needed to sit down with both of us. He sounded rehearsed. I could hear it now in a way I hadn't been able to before. The slight over-control in his voice, the careful pauses. I told him, of course. Come for dinner Saturday. He arrived with Renee and without Thomas, which told me immediately that this was business. They sat down at the same table where he'd confronted Margaret alone, and he took out a new version of the same folder, and he began his presentation. I listened to all of it. I let him finish. Renee sat beside him and filled in details when he paused, and her calmness was so studied that I thought about all the times I'd given her the benefit of the doubt over the years and felt something close to grief for my own naivety. When he was done, I said, "I'm glad you brought this to us directly, Daniel." He relaxed slightly. Renee uncrossed her arms. "Your mother and I have actually been looking into this," I said. "We've been doing some review of our own finances and estate planning. We wanted to make sure everything was in order." I slid a folder across the table to him. Inside was a letter from my lawyer, outlining the legal challenge to the power of attorney. Behind it was a summary from the forensic accountant. Behind that was a printed transcript of key portions of the security camera footage with timestamps. Behind that was documentation of the phone call tracing to the Barhaven postal code. I watched my son's face change in stages. First confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "I want you to understand," I said, keeping my voice as level as I possibly could, "that I am not going to the police today. That is a decision I have not made permanently, and it remains open depending on what happens next. What I am telling you right now is that we have had our estate planning updated. We have restructured our assets, and your mother's power of attorney has been legally voided. Our home is in a trust. There is nothing to sign and nothing to access." Renee said very quietly, "Daniel." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Dad, I can explain." "You don't need to explain the business debt," I said. "We know what it actually is. We had it independently assessed. $80,000 is a real problem, but it is not the problem you described to your mother. The numbers I gave her were not accurate." I know. The silence in the kitchen was the longest I've ever sat in. Then something happened that I had not entirely prepared for. Daniel put his face in his hands, and he started to cry. Not performance crying. I've seen that in enough depositions to know the difference. Real crying. The ugly and uncontrolled kind that people don't choose to do in front of others. He sat at my kitchen table, and he came apart in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child, and I sat across from him, and I did not move toward him. I want to tell you that was easy. It was not. Renee put a hand on his arm. She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was nothing calculated in her face. She looked like a person who had just seen something she'd been avoiding looking at directly for a long time. "We were desperate," she said. "I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm just telling you, that's what it was." "I know you were desperate," I said. "That's the only reason I'm not handing this file to the RCMP tonight." What came out over the next hour was this. Daniel's business had been struggling since 2022. He had hidden the extent of it from Renee for most of that time. And when she found out, she had panicked in a way that brought out the worst in both of them. They had borrowed against their house to stay afloat, maxed out a line of credit, fallen behind on a second mortgage. The plan to involve Margaret and I had started as Renee's idea. She admitted this. And Daniel had gone along because he couldn't see another option, and because he had spent his whole life knowing, in the back of his mind, that we would be there, that we would catch him, that we always had. That last part hit me somewhere deep, not because it excused anything. It did not excuse what they had done to Margaret. It did not excuse the calculated deception, the phone call, the documents, the way they had used Thomas's school as leverage. None of that is excusable, but there is a particular failure in parenting, and I say this as a man who devoted his adult life to being a good father, that occurs when you love a child so completely and unconditionally that they never fully develop the understanding that consequences exist, that the net can fail, that catching them is not the same as making them whole. I had always caught Daniel. Right up until the moment he tried to take something that wasn't his to take. We did not reconcile that night. I want to be honest with you about that because I think a lot of stories like this wrap up too neatly. We did not hug it out at the kitchen table. I told them they needed to leave, and that I would be in contact through my lawyer. I told them that my first concern was Margaret's well-being, and my second concern was Thomas, and that those two things would govern every decision going forward. I also told Daniel, and I want you to understand that this was not a threat. It was a statement of fact that I would not be leaving my estate to him. Not now. And not unless things change significantly over a very long period of time. I told him this directly because I believed he deserved directness. Even then, even in that moment, I did not want him to spend years assuming something that was not true. He nodded. He looked like a man who had just watched a bridge collapse behind him and was not sure yet whether the shore he was standing on was safe. They left. Margaret was in the living room. She had heard everything. She was sitting in the armchair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, very still, very composed. I sat down on the couch across from her, and we looked at each other for a moment. "How are you?" I said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." Thomas continued to come to us every other weekend. Because whatever happened between Daniel and Renee and us, that boy had nothing to do with it. And I was not going to let him feel the cold of our conflict. He came over the following Saturday, and I took him to the Rideau Canal path to walk, because the ice had started forming at the edges and he liked to look at it, and I held his hand, and he talked about his friends at school, and whether a particular hockey player was the best in the league. And I listened to everything he said. At one point, he looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, is Dad in trouble? Kids know more than we think. Your dad is going through a hard time." I said, "But he's going to figure it out. Are you mad at him?" I thought about this carefully. "I was," I said. "I'm working on something different now." "What's something different?" "Hoping he becomes who I know he can be," I said. Thomas seemed to find this satisfactory. He went back to talking about hockey. Over the following months, several things happened. Daniel and Renee hired their own financial advisor and restructured their business debt through a formal proposal to creditors under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, the legitimate process, the one that actually existed for situations like theirs. They did not lose the house. They did lose some of the commercial properties, and the business was significantly reduced. But Daniel kept working, and Renee went back to working full-time for the first time since Thomas was born. The private school question resolved itself. Thomas transferred to a very good public school in their neighborhood and adjusted quickly and made friends faster than any of us expected. My lawyer quietly closed the file, on the understanding that the voided power of attorney and the restructured assets were protection enough, and that criminal proceedings would accomplish little beyond destroying Thomas's father's life before Thomas was old enough to understand why. Margaret took longer to recover than I did. This surprised me, because she is in many ways the stronger of the two of us. But I think the wound was deeper for her than for me, because her relationship with Daniel had always been built on a faith that didn't require evidence. She had loved him without receipts. Having to examine that love in the light of what he'd done required her to rebuild it with different material. And that is slow and painful work. She did the work. She is still doing it. Some weeks are better than others. Daniel called me himself for the first time, without prompting, on a Sunday in late March. He asked if we could meet, without Renee, just the two of us. We met at a coffee shop on Spark Street, and he sat across from me and did something I had not heard from him in longer than I could remember. He apologized, not for the circumstances, not for the business failing, not for Renee's idea or for the pressure they were under. He apologized for what he had chosen to do. He said he had been thinking for months about the moment Margaret had refused to sign and had asked to talk to me first, and he said he had understood in that moment, even as he drove away, that he was hoping she wouldn't, that some part of him had been relieved when she pushed back, because some part of him had known it was wrong. "I kept going anyway," he said. "Yes," I said. "I don't know what I was thinking. I think you were thinking that I would fix it," I said, the way I always did. He looked at his coffee cup for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think you're right." We didn't hug that day either. We shook hands when we left, which felt strange, like shaking hands with someone you've known your whole life and are only just beginning to meet. But it was something. It was a beginning that I will choose to take seriously, carefully, with documentation and clear eyes and a great deal of patience, the way I handle most things that matter. Margaret came with me to Thomas's first hockey game of the season. Daniel was there with Renee. We sat in the same row of bleachers with a careful foot or two of space between us, wrapped in our coats in that particular way that Canadians learn to sit at arenas in November, slightly hunched, hands around warm cups, eyes on the ice. Thomas scored a goal in the second period and threw his arms up and looked for us immediately. And we were all four of us on our feet at once. And for a few seconds in all that cold and noise, there was nothing complicated about any of it at all. That image is the one I hold on to. Not because it means everything is resolved. It is not resolved. It may never be fully resolved, in the way that certain things that break can be repaired, but never restored to what they were before. That is a fact I have made my peace with. But that moment, Thomas looking for us and finding us there, that was real. That mattered. That is what I protected when I sat alone in my kitchen in the dark and chose strategy over anger and patience over pride. That is what Margaret protected when she looked at those documents and said, "Not without my husband." We protected the thing worth protecting, and we did it together. If you are watching this, and you recognize any part of what I've described, a child who takes more than they should, a spouse being approached alone, documents you don't fully understand being placed in front of someone you love, please don't wait. You don't need a law degree. You need someone you trust and a willingness to look clearly at what's in front of you. The answers are usually there before we're ready to see them. The courage is in the looking. That's all I have to say.